Hello, AP Comparative. This is Andrew Canine coming at you on Tuesday, the last day of March 2020. Welcome to Studio Room 2C, where there's always room to see how countries compare. We are making our way through the most important topics of AP Comparative Government as we help you to understand comparative political science, to get ready, hopefully if you take a college level political science class, and also, of course, to try to get you to rock that exam, whenever it might be. We'll get more information soon from College Board, but whenever that exam might be, we want you to rock that to get college credit to prove to the world your understanding of the concepts and skills in AP Comparative Government. Today, we are looking at topic 1.2. We're defining political organizations, some of my absolutely favorite terms in comparative political science. That helps to distinguish the 6 different core countries. And again, if you're just joining us, I'm Andrew Canine. I teach in the northern suburbs of Chicago at Adlai E. Stevenson High School. And I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank your teachers if they help direct you to these materials, these YouTube videos on College Board. And thank you for joining us to prep for the exam. So you've heard me say this before if you've tuned in previously. But it's super helpful if you go to the College Board website, the apstudents.collegeboard.org. Download the course description for AP Comparative Government. It looks like this on your screen. If you want to go directly to the PDF, go right there. Many of your teachers teach the class country by country, which is a perfectly fine way to teach the class. But the way that College Board maps out the course, it's thematically, it's by concept, and there's 3 key units that we're spending most of our time on these video broadcasts prepping for. That's units 1, 2, and 3. Just to make sure we're literally on the same page, I'd recommend that you download these course descriptions from College Board. The coding is going to make a lot more sense. Plus, there's terrific information inside those course descriptions. If you're looking for more extensive notes that I've created that are part of my PowerPoints. Of course, you can take screenshots of the PowerPoints, but you can also go to citizenu.org and go to Comparative Corner. Most of citizenu.org, which was designed by Mr. Dan Larson, my colleague at Stevenson High School, is about AP US government prep. But if you go to Comparative Corner, you can also download the PDF of what we call our text messages, which are based very much on the AP College Board course description. So getting started today, of course, we always start with shout outs. Please keep those shout outs coming at hashtag APCompGov2020 on Twitter. It is well worth getting your school and your AP comparative teacher a shout out. I have to say, I think today's shout outs covers the largest geographical area ever in the broadcast of AP Comparative Gov broadcasts. If you could do the math and figure out how many miles might separate the 2 schools, I would be interested to see that on Twitter at the hashtag APCompGov2020. But we have a shout out to LCP, who has really helped to drill in neoliberalism with their students. And from British Columbia in Canada, Ms. McGuinness at York House near Vancouver, British Columbia. And I think it's Dr. Dill or Dr. Dial. And of course, who could forget Mr. J, Colorado Clegg. And then there's Mrs. Ruthie, all the way down in Puerto Rico. So if we can get some kind of estimate, how many miles or kilometers would separate Vancouver, British Columbia from Puerto Rico? What an incredible scan of comparative government to know that students all over are studying for this test. So thank you to the students who are shouting out your teachers. We'd love to get more shout outs for those teachers. We also have a warm-up question for you, an exam practice, and that is to differentiate change in regime from change in government. Today, we are looking at the difference between regime and government. So consider that you should know those 2 terms for sure in AP Comparative Government. In a moment, we're going to go through examples of regime and government. That was the question yesterday's practice, to differentiate change in regime from change in government. And we will, I'm going to give you a sneak preview of our chart here. And you're going to see this later, the idea that you should know the difference between a government change, which we might have if you see an example of changing the government from David Cameron to Theresa May in 2016 in the United Kingdom, versus changing the regime in the United Kingdom, which we could debate our history on this, but many political scientists and historians trace back to the Magna Carta in 1215, the idea of establishing a more democratic regime in the United Kingdom. We're actually going to talk about why that would be considered democratic, looking at tomorrow's topic. And you can see here a short list of my assessment of how you could see a change in regime and a change in government in the 6 different countries. I'm going to put that chart back up later in the broadcast. So don't worry if you missed that right now, but you should know the difference between regime change and government change by the end of today. Thank you for those students who are putting out hashtags of our core country examples. We've had a number of examples. I'm missing the slide here from Eldar's examples, but we've had a number of students putting examples out onto AP CompGov 2020, including regime change and government change. So thank you. Please continue that. There's actually some good opportunities in today's lesson to interact and put out examples that are helpful for the AP students who are prepping for the exam. So today we are looking at lesson 1.2. Again, that code comes from the AP comparative course description from College Board. I showed you earlier how to get there. We are looking at defining political organizations. We already started doing that with the words regime and government and how those 2 words are different. That's one of the 2 words that really a lot of American students confuse because of some of the meaning that we've gotten in reading journalism about the word regime. But we're going to get into the difference between those. We're defining political organizations. We'd love to see you be able to differentiate a nation from a state. I'll give you some examples of those later, and also provide examples of those from the 6 different core countries. You're going to see a lot of connection between today's lesson with tomorrow 1.3, where we describe democracy and authoritarianism. So don't be confused that every day we do a topic, I'm trying to connect that back to other skills and other topics in the key units to help you get a broad understanding of AP comparative political science. We are right now just starting Unit 1. In the end, we'll do about 9 lessons from Unit 1. We'll go through Unit 2 after that, and Unit 3, and then we'll also do a little review from Unit 4 and Unit 5 right before the AP exam. And we will wrap things up on this broadcast on May the 1st. So in terms of concepts you need to know, I always start these lessons off with the key concepts. And again, I'm taking a lot of these definitions straight from the AP comparative course description. That's the nice thing about our course description. It gives a lot of great content, particularly on the definitions of words, where in some of your textbooks, you might have some varied definitions. So whatever textbook you might be using in your class, I really invite you to go back, compare these particular definitions to the definitions in your textbook, see how those definitions might compare to get a full understanding of these words. But these definitions come straight from the course description. You should know the term political systems, states, nations. We're going to differentiate between states and nations in a moment. We're going to go through all these words in today's lessons. Some other key words you should know are regimes and government. I mentioned that before. We're going back to a word that we looked at last week that was part of those initial lessons on Unit 5, and that's sovereignty. So you should know that sovereignty is the state's independent legal authority over a particular population in that territory. So you should know the word sovereignty. And then when we get into political systems, I've done a quick synopsis here of each of the 6 core countries. So bear with me. I know a lot of your teachers have gone country by country. In some cases, I know there's been some teachers who have reached out to me through social media to say, hey, I didn't get to Iran, or I didn't get to Mexico, or I was saving Nigeria till the end and I didn't get to Nigeria. The nice part about how we're doing these lessons, particularly with emphasis on the first 3 units, giving a lot of country examples from the specific countries. And again, those other countries that maybe I don't get to an example on a particular day, I'd invite you to share examples that you might know on that Twitter hashtag. So just real quick summaries of our 6 different countries. So the People's Republic of China is a political system that clearly establishes that the Chinese Communist Party is the ultimate power to rule. And we're going to learn that China tends to be much more authoritarian, particularly because they don't have national elections. It's a self-selected group that runs the Chinese Communist Party. Iran also tends to be more authoritarian. It is a theocracy. And even though they do have elections, national elections, both for their national legislature and for the president, Iran is depicted as an authoritarian government mostly because its leader, its supreme leader in this case, has to be one of the top leaders of Shia Islam. And that person acts as the head of state. And we'll see some other examples of how Iran cracks down on civil liberties and dissent that makes it more authoritarian. But an interesting country to study because they have regular national elections, even though it's more authoritarian. Nigeria's political system is based on a constitutional democracy, a constitution that Nigeria has had since 1999. They have a directly elected president who, very similar to the United States, similar to Mexico, acts as both the head of state and the head of government, an elected national legislature. Mexico is very similar. They've actually had a constitution much longer. Mexico's constitution goes back to 1917. And we're going to see some interesting parts of Mexico is that many political scientists kind of viewed Mexico as more authoritarian because the elections for much of Mexico's history haven't particularly mattered. They haven't been particularly competitive, but that has certainly changed in the last 20 years as Mexico, at least in their elections, has gained a lot more competition in their elections to make Mexico more democratic in terms of their elections. When we look at Russia, Russia has had a constitution ever since the breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. And that's when Russia came to be. We know that initially Russia had democratic elections where there was some competition, particularly for the legislative seats, but particularly under the presidencies, and I use presidencies because he's been president 2 different sets of terms, Vladimir Putin, starting in 1999. We know that during the Putin presidency, Russia became more authoritarian as the president gained more authoritarian power. But you're going to see this week, we use a particular word to describe Russia, maybe not as authoritarian, but sometimes we use the word illiberal democracy to describe Russia. And then we have United Kingdom, which is our 6th country to study. United Kingdom is categorized as a democracy. Even though it doesn't have a written constitution, they have a series of traditions and written laws that protect civil liberties, that protect political rights. They have national popular elections, even though their head of government is not directly elected. And ironically, their head of state is a monarch and gains that power and authority through birth. The United Kingdom is treated as a democracy because of the political rights and the protection of civil liberties and the fact that their elections are quite competitive. So we're going to get into a lot of those distinguishing traits of those 6 core countries in all of the upcoming lessons for units 1 through 3. But those are really quick summaries of the 6 different countries in case your teacher might not have gotten to 1 or 2 of those countries before we've had this hiatus from class. 2 more terms that you should be familiar with, and I mentioned this yesterday, if you took AP Human Geography or AP European History, you're probably really well versed in the difference between a state and a nation. And this is where you get some really interesting examples from the 6 different core countries in AP Comparative Government. In particular, a state is essentially the country or the government. And in many cases around the world in political science, you would use state as a synonym for country or government. And that can be sometimes confusing for American students, because when we think of states, obviously, we think of particular regional governments in the 50 United States of America. Um, and I don't want to get too much into American history or US government, but if you remember at the beginning of the United States of America with the Articles of Confederation, in many ways, our 13 original states really kind of acted as independent countries. And it was a confederation of states back then, almost similar to how the European Union acts today with member states of the EU. But when you hear the word states in comparative government, unless it's specific to, let's say, the regional governments of Mexico or the regional governments of Nigeria, both of those countries can use the word state as a description of a regional government in Mexico and Nigeria. But typically you're going to see the word state and it's going to refer to a national government, again, as a synonym for country. When we use the word nation, we're typically looking at a common cultural bond that a particular group of people have. And a particular nation might not have a government. In some cases, a particular nation might not necessarily even have a territory. It might not be at one particular geographic spot, but it's a cultural commonality that connects a group of people. That commonality could be a combination of language, religion, ethnicity, different identities. So if you look at our 6 core countries in AP comparative government, or 6 core states, each of our countries has specific nations that will be examples of nations within those states. So in China, we're talking about the Uyghurs. In Northwest China, particularly in a Muslim area of Northwest China called Xinjiang, or the province of Xinjiang, versus Tibetans, which are in the southwest corner of China. And in Iran, you have Persians as a nation, or Azeris. If you're familiar with the Kurds are a good example of a nation that can cross national boundaries. So you would have a strong Kurdish nation in Iran, Iraq, bits of Syria, and also Turkey. And even though there's no specific country, an officially recognized country as Kurdistan, for instance. But the Kurds are recognized as a nation. In Mexico, a good example of a nation would be down in Chiapas, in the more indigenous peoples, particularly in southern Mexico. You would see kind of a nation in terms of that, and the mestizo, the majority population of Mexico. In Russia, we're talking about the difference between Russians and then the Chechens down in the Caucasus region of Russia, and the Chechens tend to be Islamic, and the Tartars. And in Nigeria, you have key different nations, including the Hausa, the Yoruba, and the Igbo, who predominantly live in different parts of Nigeria. And then with the United Kingdom, you could actually use the word nation to describe the Scottish, the Irish, the English, and the Welsh. And I'm going to show you an example of that from the United Kingdom in a moment. And in fact, we're going to go right to that. If you think of the flag of the United Kingdom, the flag, the Union Jack, right here at the top, that is a flag that represents the state of the United Kingdom. That's the official name of the country of the United Kingdom. And that flag itself represents 4 of the different nations that make up the United Kingdom. So in each of the nations, well, Wales, we can debate how much Wales is actually in the Union Jack. We know Wales is a nation that's part of the United Kingdom. But in terms of the flag, special emphasis goes to the flag down here in the lower left, which is a flag from the nation of Scotland. And this flag represents the patron saint of Scotland, if you will, the cross of St. Andrew, which is the diagonal, the crisscross white cross. And you can see that the field of blue and the crisscross white cross is part of the Union Jack. That is how Scotland is represented in the flag. Northern Ireland is also in there with the cross of St. Patrick, as is England and Wales, both England and Wales. Whoops. The patron saint is St. George, and the dominant red cross in the middle of the Union Jack is the cross of St. George. So that's kind of how Wales is in there. So I put this map down in the lower right-hand corner. This is the hypothetical map of if Scotland were to someday declare independence, and if Scotland were to break away from the United Kingdom and become the independent state of Scotland, if it was actually the country of Scotland, the Union Jack, I suppose, would have to change to remove Scotland from the Union Jack, the flag of the United Kingdom. And, you know, perhaps it might look like this without the blue background. So another way you can think of nation and state is if you follow sports, especially international sports. There are some athletic competitions where countries compete as states. For instance, the Olympics. The United Kingdom competes as athletes from the United Kingdom compete as the United Kingdom. But if you follow World Cup soccer or international rugby, you'll know that in many cases, those nations actually compete in some of those international events. So for instance, with international rugby, one of the most famous rugby tournaments in the world is called the Six Nations Championship, in which case you would have Scotland, Wales, and England all competing as separate nations in that international tournament. And actually the athletes from Northern Ireland, which is the fourth region of the United Kingdom, those athletes from Northern Ireland actually compete with athletes from the Republic of Ireland as the nation of Ireland. So that's an athletic contest where the athletes actually compete as nations rather than as the formal states that they might in the Olympics. So two other words you should know, and I've mentioned this before, this was the opening warm-up, the difference between regimes and government. Regimes and government, again, when a lot of American students, when they come into my class, they almost 100%, they've heard the word regime, and it's typically used in contemporary news sources as a negative phrase to describe authoritarian governments. So, you know, going back to the 90s, the Saddam Hussein regime. And that's not necessarily false, but in political science, especially comparative political science, we're using the word regime to talk about a long-standing tradition of power. And in some cases, these are established by long-standing constitutions like the United States. Our constitutional regime goes back to 1787. In some cases, like the United Kingdom, where there's not a written constitution, you could trace that regime back more to a tradition of governing that can go back, in some cases, hundreds of years. And some of the regimes that we look at can go back a much shorter time. For instance, in Iran, the theocracy, the Islamic Republic of Iran, would trace its history back to the 1979 Islamic Revolution. So that regime's been in power since 1979. And the word regime is differentiated from the word government because a government is the actual governing body at that particular time. And in many cases, the government is described as kind of the executive that is running the government at that time. So we have that phrase, head of government. So in the United Kingdom, we use the phrase head of government to describe the prime minister and the majority party of the House of Commons that the prime minister leads. And that's that particular government at that time. I think the best way to explore the difference between regime and government is actually that chart that I showed you earlier. I'm gonna give you a moment to take that chart in. I've taken all 6 core countries and I have tried to describe when a lot of political scientists and historians kind of start that particular regime, and then how that contrasts with a change of government, which can be done by election or it can be done by tradition, as we'll see in some of these countries. So I'm going to give you a moment to peruse that. So I've been talking a little bit more about the United Kingdom today, and that's where that regime was established going back to the Magna Carta. And certainly the most current government change I have here listed on the chart from David Cameron to Theresa May in 2016. And the most current would be from Theresa May to Boris Johnson, which happened just this fall of 2019. That would be an example of a government change. Or the most recent government change in Mexico, that date should actually be 2018, was when Peña Nieto stepped down because of term limits in 2018 to President Lopez Obrador. Or President Xi, the government change in China was when President Xi took over from President Hu back in 2012. That's not done by an election, but it was done by a party mandate. But we know that China's regime goes back to the Communist Revolution of 1949. They do have a constitution that established the dominance of the Chinese Communist Party, and political scientists tend to describe China as an authoritarian government. And again, Russia can sometimes be in between. We'll discuss that more later this week. How would we categorize Russia? But we know that the current regime was created by a constitution in 1993, and then a government change would be President Putin to President Medvedev in 2008. That was the 4 years in between President Putin's 2 terms. If you're paying attention to current events, and I know in many of your comparative government classes you are, a really good question is going to be, what will Russia's government look like in just a few weeks, in a very short time, when a constitutional referendum is put in place to really restructure big chunks of Russia's, especially their executive branch? And how will political scientists categorize Russia after that? So you don't have to know those specific changes. The AP comparative government test is not a current events test. Even in a regular year, it's not a current events test where you have to keep up to date with all of those changes. But certainly if you are well versed in current events, in some cases you can use examples from current news and apply that to FRQs as evidence or examples of core countries. But we don't need to necessarily make those changes here in this chart because, one, those changes haven't taken place. And we're gonna wait to see what changes actually formally take place. Iran, like I mentioned before, their regime started in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution and the creation of the theocracy in Iran. But we have had government change going back to 2013 when President Ahmadinejad was replaced by President Rouhani, the current president of Iran, and that was because of both a combination of term limits and a national presidential election in Iran. And the last time we saw government change in Nigeria was when President Goodluck Jonathan lost an election in 2015 to President Buhari. So some practice today as we look more at all these terms that define political organizations. I'm going to put some multiple choice, and then I've got some sample FRQ here. So the term regime change will be used to describe which of the following: a 2016 switch in the United Kingdom for Prime Minister Cameron to Prime Minister May, the founding of the Constitution in 1917 in Mexico, the switch from Putin to Medvedev in 2008, or the coup in Nigeria in 1975. So which of the following would be a regime change? I threw a curveball in there. So we'll see what the answer is, and B is the answer. So the founding of Mexico's Constitution in 1917 after revolution. Letter D becomes kind of a curveball in there because you see the word coup, and many times we assume that a coup leads to a regime change. But I think a key there is the fact that in that 1975 coup, one military leader was replaced with another military leader. So it really wasn't a long-standing change in the type of government that Nigeria had in 1975 as a result of that coup. So that would not be considered by political scientists to be a regime change. Question number 2 for 1.2. The term governmental change will be used to describe which of the following. And then we have a number of different examples, including Peña Nieto to López Obrador. And I don't know why I thought that happened in 2019. I got to go back and switch these. But in B, the founding of Mexico's constitution in 1917 after the revolution. The 1949 revolution in China is another potential answer. And the 1993 constitution in Russia that replaced the governing structure of the Soviet Union. And the answer here is, even though the date is wrong, A, the replacement of President Peña Nieto to President López Obrador by election. How about just a quick vocab question? The independent legal authority over a population in a particular territory is defined by which of these? And hopefully it doesn't take you too long to know that the answer to that is sovereignty. The independent legal authority over a population in a particular territory is defined by sovereignty. Oh, we got the double question here. A political organization that combines a permanent population with governing institutions to exercise control over a defined territory with international recognition, define which term? And the bottom question is, which term is defined as a group of people with commonalities, including race, religion, ethnicity, political identity, and aspirations? And we got the twin questions here. And let's see if I got the twin answers on the next screen. I'm going to give you a chance to read through those. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And here we have the difference between state and nation. So hopefully you knocked those out of the park. We are going to move into, let's move into a practice free response question. This could be free response question number 1. This is a 4-point rubric. It's called the conceptual analysis question, where we assess your ability to define or describe a political concept and explain or compare political systems, principles, institutions, processes, policies, and behaviors. So here's a potential FRQ that I wrote that brings in some words from today, and that is A, define a nation. B, describe the difference between a nation and a state. And then C, explain one reason why a government would legally recognize a nation within its borders. And D, explain why a government's decision to legally recognize a nation could reduce the governing state's sovereignty. So that's an example of where we could take words or concepts from, in this case, all from Unit 1, and create a conceptual analysis question to assess your understanding and your writing skills related to them. So I'm going to show you some examples of how I could write this, or how a student could write this. So whenever you're asked to define a word, if you're just tuning in and this is your first review broadcast, my big tip in FRQ writing is when you're asked to define a concept or describe a concept, not only should you provide that definition from what you can remember of that definition, but would really, really encourage you to try to use an example of that concept. So in this case, a nation is a population with a common cultural connection. An example would be the nation of Uyghurs inside China. So even if another part of that FRQ is asking for an example of that concept, I would really get in that good habit of being complete with your definitions and your descriptions of concepts and provide, in some cases, a concrete example. But let me be really, really clear. In conceptual analysis, FRQ number 1, you do not need to have an actual country-specific example from any one of the AP 6 countries. You could use a hypothetical. You could say country A and use a hypothetical example to articulate an example of a concept. But if you know an example from one of our core countries, I would invite you to use that. In this case, an example of a nation would be the Uyghurs inside China. For letter B, make sure if you're asked to describe a difference between two concepts, make sure you're describing both of those concepts. So you can say, describe the difference between a nation and a state. While China is a sovereign state that has the power to rule, Uyghurs are a nation of people living in a province of China with a common culture, Islam, but without any real authority to make rules to govern. So while a sovereign state has the rules to govern, the power to rule, a nation doesn't necessarily have that real authority to make rules to govern. So make sure if you're asked to differentiate between two terms, make sure you're writing about both terms. Just don't write about one term and assume that the reader knows that the opposite is true for the other term. Put both terms in there. And again, if you can put a concrete example, do so. And if you can make that concrete example about one of the 6 core countries, that's great. You're not going to be assessed on whether you put an example in for this particular question, but you can certainly do that, and it can help you out in some situations. Going on to answer more of this question, explain one reason why a government would legally recognize a nation within its borders. So we have an explanation here. You're going to see it says, explain one reason why. So I've been really emphasizing through these review broadcasts that if you're asked to explain how or explain why, make sure you put a word of causation to make sure that you're fully answering this question. A government would legally recognize a nation within its borders in order to increase the political legitimacy of that government. For instance, Uyghurs are legally recognized minority group in China so that China's government can claim to recognize minority rights in order to boost its image among its people to increase its political legitimacy. We'll be talking more about legitimacy later in Unit 1. Hopefully it's a term that your teacher's gone over that you might recognize. So I'm kind of giving you a preview of some material. But that becomes a reason why a government would legally recognize a nation within its borders. Again, I've used the example from China, the Uyghurs. You don't have to do that. You could use a hypothetical nation in a hypothetical state in this case. And then answering letter D, explain why a government's decision to legally recognize a nation within its borders could reduce that governing state's sovereignty. This gets a little bit more complicated in your explanation, so make sure you're complete. Reuse the vocabulary from the prompt to really heighten your clarity, but make sure you answer this. And in some cases, if it feels redundant, that's fine, but make sure you're answering the prompt. A governing state's sovereignty could be reduced by legally recognizing a nation within its borders because that decision could motivate that nation of peoples to break away. Legally recognizing a nation could inspire a separatist movement within that country that could challenge and then reduce that government's state sovereignty and ability to rule that particular region of the country. Separatist movement, again, is a term that we'll be talking about more in these upcoming topics, but you should be very familiar with the term sovereignty and how recognizing a nation could in some cases lead to reducing of the governing of that state sovereignty if there becomes a separatist movement in that particular region of the country. So that's some skills on how to practice your FRQ writing that specifically relate to FRQ number 1, related to a lot of the concepts that we've been looking at here in topic 1.2. Again, some of those words we've been looking at: political systems, states, nation, the difference between regime and government, and sovereignty. And I want to make special emphasis that these, whenever there's an asterisk, that means it's coming straight from that course description. So feel free to use and refer to that as review. You're going to see that in a couple of days, I'll be bringing these concepts up again in topic 1.4 about democratization, and later in 1.6 when we're talking a little bit more about sovereignty and how democratic regimes can maintain sovereignty. So if you have more country-specific examples of nations, particularly of nations, I would invite you to put those country-specific examples at hashtag APCompGov2020. And I'm going to leave you with this AP exam practice to differentiate democratic regimes from authoritarian regimes. So tomorrow we're going to get into the difference between democracy and authoritarianism. And I'm telling you, if you're reading your current events, particularly with how countries are responding to COVID-19 and coronavirus, I think you should be reading a lot of international news to see what a lockdown looks like in China, or what a lockdown looks like in Moscow, and how that's different from lockdowns in more democratic countries like the United States, like United Kingdom. And one of the interesting stories that's coming out in the last 48 hours is the country of Hungary, that's part of the European Union, in how their legislature just gave new powers to the prime minister that some people are describing as more authoritarian. So I would definitely invite you to read some current events news to see if you can differentiate democratic regimes from authoritarian regimes, particularly in how governments respond to policy crises like COVID-19. So one last note, if you know somebody who is having trouble accessing technology for these reviews, or maybe for the actual AP exam that's going to be on your devices, please direct them to this website, cb.org/tech. Thank you very much for tuning in. We'll see you tomorrow on April 1st as we look at democracy versus authoritarianism. Take care. Have a good evening.